Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming in. I hope you've enjoyed your weekend and the weather's been kind. Up in Scotland, the weather has been crap today, but can't complain after a week long heat wave that we had. So, and by the way, I'm not wearing makeup. I'm quite red. I done a live the other night, and it was after we came off. I looked back at it and I looked as if I had blush or lipstick on. I don't. It's just that us Scottish people are meant to be like milk white, but we're not used to the sun. Anyway, welcome to the first of our lives about Jack the Ripper.
Or revisited lives.
Revisited lives about Jack the Ripper. So tonight we get Sarah, we get Jennifer down there. I still can't get the hang of that camera thing.
Yeah,
And
I'm
our special guest tonight is Mr. Mike Covell. I hope I said that right. I hope I've got this. We'll go Mike. Mike's in. Who is who's done a book on Jack the Ripper, and he's also a Ripperologist. This is a term I've spoken to a few people, and some people don't like the term Ripperologist. So before we kick off, Mike, I'm going to ask you your opinion on the title. Hi, Nicky Dog. What do you think of the term Ripperologist?
I prefer local historian.
Right, we'll stick with that. So Mike's a local historian. So as I said, we're going to be covering Jack the Ripper, and the next show we're going to be doing the H.H. Holmes side of it, if there is a side of it. So without further ado, Mike's going to tell us. I'm just not getting this right, am I?
There you go. You got it.
The floor's all yours, Mike, if you want to tell us about Jack the Ripper.
Right, so it depends on your belief system. And this is one of the things in the Jack the Ripper case that really throws people. So some people believe that Martha Tabram was the first victim. Now, Martha was found on the morning of August 7th, 1888, at 4:50 in the morning in a place called George Yard, which is just off Whitechapel Road. And she suffered horrific wounds. She was stabbed in a total of 39 times, which seems quite a frenzy. And that included wounds in a left lung, a right lung, her heart was stabbed. And the doctor examining her, Dr. Colleen, he testified that at least 2 sharp objects were used. And he said a knife and possibly a dagger or a bayonet. So that then led people to believe that perhaps it was a military man. And then the next big thing happened at 3:40 a.m. on the morning of Friday, August 31st. The body of Mary Ann Nichols, who was known as Polly Nichols, was found dead on a place called Bucks Row, which is today known as Darewood Street. Her throat had been cut by 2 very distinct wounds. And they were very deep, one of which severed the tissue all the way back down to the vertebrae. So it's quite a deep cut. She'd been stabbed twice in her sexual organs and the lower part of her abdomen as well. And that was ripped open. There was a deep, jagged wound that was across her bowels, and her bowels were actually protruding from the wound. And it was just discovered later on that she also had a number of other incisions around the body on either side of her abdomen. And these wounds were all made by the same knife in a downward stroke. A week later, on Saturday, September 8th, 1888, Annie Chapman was murdered. And Annie's body was discovered at approximately 6 a.m. in the morning. She was at the bottom of some steps in the rear yard of 29 Hanbury Street, which was in the districts of Spitalfields, which is right next to Whitechapel. Annie's body had been cut by 2 very deep cuts. Her abdomen had also been cut open. A section of flesh from her stomach was removed and placed over her left shoulder, along with a small intestine, which was removed and placed over her right shoulder. An autopsy revealed that sections of her uterus and of her bladder and her vagina had been removed. So quite ghastly. You can imagine, finding that in the early hours of the morning can't have been very nice. On September 25th, 1888, a letter was written, and this would become known as the Dear Boss letter. And at that time, this opened the floodgates for Ripper letters. For some people, this is a wonderful area of kind of a clue. For other people, it kind of muddied the waters a little bit, because obviously all of these Ripper letters were written by, not everyone was written by Jack the Ripper. People believe that these had been written by everything from people in asylums to normal people on the street, and even newspaper men got blamed for them as well, which we'll get onto in a minute. But the Dear Boss letter was postmarked September 27th, and it was sent to the Central News Agency. And then it was later forwarded to Scotland Yard, but not for a further 2 days. So Scotland Yard got it on September 29. Some believed it was a hoax, but the letter had reference to a cutting of a victim's ears off, which we'll come on to shortly. And the Dear Boss letter was linked by some to Catherine Eddowes, which we'll come on to shortly. Later, on September 30th, 2 victims would appear that night, late night, early morning, and this became known as the double event. And this was the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered at 1 o'clock in the morning in a place called Duckfield Yard, which stood off Berner Street, which is today known as Henrique Street, and this was in Whitechapel. She had a single cut across her throat, and this was 6 inches long. It was quite deep, and it had severed a left carotid artery and also a trachea, and terminated below jaw. Now, because she wasn't mutilated like the other victims, some people have been led to believe that she wasn't a victim of Jack the Ripper. Some people believe she had a domestic argument with her partner, Michael Kidney, and they believe that he murdered her and made it look like a Ripper killing to throw doubt upon him and cast the light on Jack the Ripper. But a short while later, 45 minutes later, so 3/4 of an hour later, on the same Sunday morning, a short distance away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in the corner of Mitre Square. And this was in the City of London district. So Jack the Ripper had gone from the East End and had gone into the City district. So you had the Metropolitan Police and the City of Police now were both involved. Some believe that this was a blessing, having 2 police forces working together. Some believe that it kind of affected the investigation, because you had two competing police forces, all of them trying to the one-upmanship, and obviously things were missed or perhaps weren't looked at. But she was found in the corner of Mitre Square. Her throat had been severed from ear to ear. Her abdomen had been ripped open by a long, jagged, deep wound, and her intestines were placed over her right shoulder. A section of her intestine was removed and placed between her body and her left arm. The left kidney and a large part of her uterus had been removed, and her face was disfigured with her nose cut off. Her cheeks were slashed with V's that pointed up to the eye, and then her eyes were slashed straight down. Some people believe that these facial cuts had something to do with, some people said she looked like a clown in a circus and all this kind of stuff. A section of her right ear was removed. And later on during the autopsy, when they were pulling her clothing apart, this fell out onto the autopsy table. So you'll remember that Jack the Ripper letter mentioned about cutting of ears. And here you have an example of an ear being cut. So a short while later at 2:55 a.m., in a doorway of a tenement at a place called Golson Street in Whitechapel, a chalk inscription was discovered. And this read, "The Jews of the men will not be blamed for nothing." And this became known as the Golson Street Graffito. Now, it was directly above a piece of bloody apron, which it was said had come from the body of Catherine Eddowes. Now, again, there's 2 schools of thought here. One is that the inscription on the wall was linked directly to the case and was a clue. The other is that it was purely coincidental that was there and had nothing to do with the case. But whatever, the top police officer at the time turned up and ordered that it be washed away. A couple of the officers on scene made inscriptions in their notebooks of what the wording said, but the wording was washed away. So no photographs were taken or anything like that. And we know that photographs were in existence back then. So it could have been documented, and it never was, which is a shame. On October 1st, 1888, the Central News Agency received another letter. This was known as the Saucy Jackie postcard. and this was postmarked October 1st, 1888. This featured reference to a double event. So people believed again that this could have been linked to Jack the Ripper. It was later claimed, however, that many of the letters that were signed Jack the Ripper were created by a journalist named Frederick Best of the Central News Agency, and he wrote for the Star. He claimed that he and his colleague had hoaxed a number of letters and that he'd sent these out in order to keep the news story alive and to keep it in the press, because obviously the more articles that are written, the more copies of newspapers will sell. So these horrific crimes were being used as an incentive to get all these newspapers published and make a little bit of money. In later years, a lady by the name of Nini Andrea, she conducted a survey, a forensic examination of these letters. And when she was examining these letters, she produced a paper called An Authorship Analysis of the Jack the Ripper letters, and she found strong linguistic evidence that some of these letters were written by the same people. So whether or not that was the real Jack the Ripper, or whether or not it was the pressman creating this mystique, this kind of mythos around the name and these murders, these poor ladies. On October 1588, a letter was sent to George Lusk. He was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and this was known as the From Hell letter. You'll probably remember the Johnny Depp movie, From Hell. That was based on the graphic novel by Alan Moore, which was called From Hell. And this basically said that it took a piece of the kidney and sent it to George Lusk, and in this box George Lusk had a piece of the kidney. Now this was interesting because this was then sent to Dr. Openshaw, and Dr. Openshaw at the Royal London Hospital, he examined it and he said that he believed it came from a woman that had been killed or had died recently, and it showed evidence that this woman had been alcoholic. But then there was two schools of thought there, because at the time there was conflicting evidence published in the press. So the case just gets muddier and muddier and muddier. So when you're studying it, it's really confusing because it leads you off into all these alleyways. The final victim, the final commonly accepted victim of Jack the Ripper, was found on the Friday morning of November 9th, 1888, at 10:45 in the morning. And her name that was given at the time by some of her friends was Mary Kelly, or Mary Jeanette Kelly. To this day, we still haven't proved conclusively the identity of this victim. We just know her by this name that her friends gave. So we don't even know if it's a real name. And again, that's muddied the waters a little bit. There's been researchers that have looked into this for years and years and years. A researcher called Chris Scott, who's sadly passed away now, he spent years and years trying to identify and ascertain the identity of Mary Kelly. But she was found in 13 Miller's Court, which was off Dorset Street. And she was perhaps the worst mutilated out of all the victims. Her face and her body had been hacked beyond all recognition. Her partner, Joseph Barnett, went to the autopsy and later the inquest, and he said he could only identify her by her eyes and her ears alone. Everything else was beyond recognition. And he'd basically, the killer had basically chopped her face off and hacked away, cut the lips. Her throat had been severed down to her spine. Her abdomen had been removed of all its organs. A uterus and kidneys and one of her breasts were cut and put under her head. Other parts of her body had been placed at the foot of the bed next to her feet. Sections of her abdomen and thigh had been removed and placed on the bedside table, and her heart was missing. It was never accounted for. There was a hot fire in the grate, and we know this because whoever had lit this fire had melted the solder on the teapot, between the teapot and the spout. And some people have been led to believe that perhaps the heart was thrown into the fire and that's what caused this inferno, or perhaps the killer was taking his clothes off and burning them. There's so many different theories. And she became the last victim. There were many more Whitechapel murders after that in the vicinity. At the same time, there was the Thames-So murders, where a number of body parts were being washed up along the Thames and in certain buildings adjacent to the Thames. And it became kind of convoluted in later years because you had people that would read perhaps certain newspapers and believe what they were reading and regurgitate those stories as fact. And when you look back at the case, a lot of the early stories that came into it, Jack the Ripper had a Gladstone bag. False. Jack the Ripper wore a top hat. false. Jack the Ripper wore a cloak, false. These were all stories that were spread at the time and that had since grown legs, and various researchers had picked up on this false stories and created this kind of mythos, and this kind of version of Jack the Ripper. And since then, over the years, Jack the Ripper's kind of been taken, he's been put into computer games, comics. He's become a fictional character. Nowadays, he gets taught as part of the GCSE history in secondary schools in England. I'm not sure about Scotland, but in England, in some of the GCSE syllabuses in history, Jack the Ripper is still taught. I go to schools to teach Jack the Ripper, and a lot of the kids that get taught this have come in and they've come from a background of playing computer games with Jack the Ripper as a character, where Jack the Ripper is going against Sherlock Holmes, and kids come into it and they sit down in lesson and say, "Well, I love Jack the Ripper," and I'm like, "But you're only getting what you're getting from games and comics. When I tell you the real facts, you will completely change your mind." And it's an amazing case, and that is just the bare basics. If you could go into each murder, you could probably spend a full show on each murder and a full show on each victim, and so on and so forth. It's a massive case. There's been hundreds of thousands of books published on the case. There's been over 300 suspects linked to the case. There's been radio shows, podcasts, television shows, documentaries, movies, you name it. And it's such a big case. And to this day, it still attracts international attention, so much so that we still have, and if you can see that, Jack the Ripper conferences. Just recently, I acquired, I don't know if you can see these, Jack the Ripper coins. So, and they have images of Jack the Ripper on. So it's still a big industry. It's still a big trade. And at the end of the day, you've got these 5, or if you're including Martha Tabram, 6 victims, these poor women that were murdered, in quite horrific circumstances.
Mike is alive. Just to put somebody's comment. That's Jem from Australia. You're a legend, she says. How Mike remembers all this stuff blows my mind. Excuse me. So just say hi to Laura, Charles, Jacqueline as well, and Facebook user. Don't know who that is yet, but no doubt we'll find out. But as you see, Mike, it is a massive case. There's that many. Yes, I have I don't have any great knowledge of it. I remember growing up and Jack the Ripper, the top hat, the cloak image, the doctor's bag, stuff like that. Sherlock Holmes and everything. I've seen some films, documentaries on it, but there is that many theories on it. And as you say, with 2 police forces coming together, I think that would just spell trouble. Because you say the one-upmanship that we want to prove who is. You've got one side want to prove solve it before the other side, and it just end up tripping over each other and what have you. And I think you say the video games, comics, coins, and I think that kind of takes the focus. That's just my opinion. The focus away from the 5 victims. Because these were maybe whatever their occupation was, regardless. There were people, there were women, there were human beings, and they suffered a horrible, horrible end at the hands of a maniac, whatever you want to call him. I know he's got some even think he was a hero. I've heard that over the years as well, thinking he was some kind of hero sort of thing. Where they get that, I don't know. But I think that takes the focus away from these 5 women who were just mutilated, especially the last one. Who suffered the kind of worst mutilation with, or bits and pieces getting removed. What do you think, ladies?
I just think it's such a complex story. And obviously, at the time, there was 11 murders happened within a short space of time. And obviously, 5 of them are classed as iconically 5. But in my opinion, I think that more of them were Jack the Ripper, not just the 5. But again, that's just different opinions on whether it was just the 5 or whether the other ones could be included.
What do you know why they didn't include the other ones? Yeah, I know they say there was 5 victims, and then some people say he just kind of disappeared. He stopped doing it. Any idea
So
why they didn't include these other victims?
at the time, the top police officers, all well, not all agreed, but agreed on certain victims and how they were to be included based on the modus operandi of the murders, the time period that it happened, the location. So those 5 became known as the canonical 5, and they were the ones that were talked about the most and included in the frameworks the most. But what you'll find is when people come to the case, if they have a particular suspect, they'll try and include other victims to fit in with their suspect, or remove victims that don't fit in with their suspect. So we found that a lot where they change from book to book. You know, some people will say, well, we're not having that person because they don't fit in with the age range of this particular suspect and this kind of thing. You know, so no one can really agree on the suspects. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of people that think Martha Tabram might have been. There was some before that as well. But there's a lot of people that don't agree with Elizabeth Stride. There's some people that said Mary Kelly shouldn't be because she was so horrific and she was inside. People have said that perhaps she was not a victim, that someone else had killed her, perhaps like a lover or someone who was quite angry with her and things like that. They said the modus operandi differed because she was killed inside and not outdoors. So even that becomes kind of convoluted. And then you get things like all the police officers had their own opinions and their own theories. So that makes it all the more convoluted. And then you had things like the Ripper letters coming in, which would mention some things but not others. And that would also become quite convoluted and so on. And then you had people writing books. You know, it amazes me a lot of the times when I go to lectures and stuff like that, people will pick up one Jack the Ripper book. They will read it and automatically assume that that verdict is the truth. And more often than not, we find that some of the suspects that have been put forward are on very shaky historical ground. Many weren't in the area at the time. Some weren't even in Great Britain at the time. You know, so you find that a lot of the people that put forward suspects do it based on very dodgy evidence. We've seen examples of people falsifying evidence, actually going into the archives and falsifying documents in a bid to fit up their suspects. So it's a very, very shady world and quite interesting. But yeah, I do think maybe you know, it should be more than 5. There were victims that came after that. All the way up to 1892, there were still victims being killed in the East End, and all of these were unfortunate women, and all of them killed by the knife. So it fits in with the modus operandi. It's just that those at the time, those police officers were just convinced that those 5 women were the 5 victims.
Did you have a couple of questions for you? What's your thoughts on it, Jennifer?
Sorry about that. I had a tickle in my throat, so I'm glad. Yeah, I was muted. My thoughts are, as far as serial killers are concerned, when I look at Jack the Ripper, I see you have the beginning, how he started. So who's to say that he didn't continue on past those 5, that he changed his MO, maybe he developed more, maybe he had a better idea. I mean, with Mary Kelly, I mean, I have my own thoughts that maybe it was a Jack the Ripper and that he just had more time versus when you're outdoors, you have the fear of being caught, you have the fear of someone always coming around. But when you're indoors, and if Mary Kelly, which you said, we don't know if that's her real name, if she was ever known to be squirmy, loud, screaming, if she did any of that stuff, neighbors aren't going to come to her rescue. So they're going to think it's a domestic dispute. That's how I would take it. So I would think that if Mary Kelly was and is a Jack the Ripper victim, then I would say that he just had more time with her because he was indoors. And I don't want to discount her because of the way things. I mean, I've read a lot of those reports. I've read too many Jack the Ripper books to count. And you're right. A lot of them say one thing, another say another, and you have to take this, you got to take that. You got to go, where's the middle? And she's definitely an interesting, but to say that she was the last, or I don't think so. I think that he changed his modus operandi, stayed quiet for a while, let the heat get off of him and then start again. But as you said, there's still the knife cut, but he changed. And after a while, I mean, even known serial killers that have never been caught, they have a cooling down period. Sometimes they start up again, and sometimes they just disappear from history altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry.
See, we were talking today when we were away, and it was the last victim, Mary Kelly. That kind of struck me because the other victims, they were egalitarian. The first one was like 39 times stabbed. I watched a lot of crime.
She's not really classed as a ripper killing, but I think she would be.
The other victims have multiple times, and I've watched a few crime documentaries, and they say, you're going to kill somebody, stab them a couple of times, job done, basically. But when it starts to get to 10, 15, 20 times, that's a whole different level. But when we were talking today, I thought of Mary Kelly because Jennifer just said, she was actually just said, but I was going to say, it seemed that he did take his time with it. He knew what he was wanting to do, and he had all the time in the world just to, he could have been there gone in a couple of hours, whatever, I don't know. And the way that she was kind of, cut up and where different body parts were laid out on the table, head, it just seemed that I wasn't too sure whether she was actually a Ripper victim or somebody else because the other ones had seemed a kind of frenzy to me.
True, but you got when you look back of how she was cut up, how she was dissected was very. Even though there was some differences from the other victims, she had anatomy removed, just like others, and so you have the very first. I mean, he was talking about the very first victim, simple, and then it just each one escalated, and if it is a Jack the Ripper person or victim, maybe that was the one time that he could just let it all go. And then if he did continue after he cooled off and continued on and still used his main MO of the slicing knife or whatever, he probably reinvented himself if he still was out there. It's very possible. A lot of serial killers that I've read about do this. They'll go for a while, have like 3 or 4 victims being the same, and then the next 3 victims hardly match the MO, but it was the same person. Since this was back in the 1800s, it's harder because, as you said, a lot of things. There's shoddy police work. There's so many different things, different stories that people came forward with. I mean, I'm coming from an American point of view. I've never been to England. I've never been to that London area to know any more than what I've just read or seen. But that's just my opinion, of course.
You made a couple of good points today about the sex worker side and how they kind of overfound in the kind of same sort of location.
Aye, if you look at the map where they were all found, they were found kind of within the one area.
I have a question though. Why, of all the people that they've come forward thinking is Jack the Ripper, where did the idea of a woman come up? How did that come to play? That a woman could have been Jack the Ripper? Because I keep hearing this one, and I cannot put them together. I can't put the pieces together for that to work.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask. Mike, Jenny, thanks for stealing my question.
What if it was a joke?
So, if you look at people like Annie Chapman, before she was murdered, she was seen walking out with an unknown gentleman. So she wasn't seen with a woman, she was seen with a man. Catherine Eddowes was seen speaking to a man before she entered Mitre Square. Mary Kelly was seen with a man before she was murdered. So you have all these eyewitnesses that saw men in or around the vicinity where the murders took place. So there was never any women seen with the women. But then you got people trying to link it up with Mary Ann Piercy and various other female serial killers and so on. And many of the women that they tried to blame were often involved with things like the murder of the husband or baby farming. So a completely different modus operandi to what Jack the Ripper was doing. And then, of course, they would have to overpower these victims. So that kind of goes against it being a fellow female. But it's weird. It keeps cropping up, like you say. The identity of Jack being a Jacqueline has come up on several occasions through the years. And the people who study the case, they roll their eyes and think, "Oh, not again." But yeah, it's usually in the tabloids in the UK. We go through a period. Once a year, they'll come out with a suspect. Once a year, they'll say there's new evidence. Once a year, they'll say there's DNA evidence. And then every 2 or 3 years, they'll say it's a woman. So we go through cycles.
It's crazy to go through all those cycles. I mean, I'm thwarted with the whole DNA evidence. How much DNA evidence do you think they could have after all this time that's viable? I don't understand. But I think one of the most interesting ones, what was it, the painter, when they thought that the painter was from France? I'm like, what? Okay. That's
Walter
right.
Sickert was put forward on several occasions by several different people, and every time the story changed. In the original story, he was the man responsible for painting the royal carriage after the murders had taken place, and he was linked to the royal conspiracy. And then the story changed, and they said, well, maybe he was painting the murder scenes because he'd been told about it by Jack the Ripper himself. And then it evolved, and he became Jack the Ripper. But then he was painting these pictures. In actual fact, Sickert created something called the Camden Town Murder Series. And just like everybody else had a fascination with Jack the Ripper, at the time of his murders, at the time of these Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, we can't even prove Sickert was in the country at the time because he was sending letters from Dieppe in France. And over the years, people have tried to fit him up with the case, and no one's ever really proved the evidence. And in terms of the DNA, a couple of years ago, a suspect was put forward, and it was claimed that his name was Kosminski. He was a Polish Jewish gentleman, and it was claimed he was linked to Catherine Eddowes, and that they'd found DNA evidence to prove it. And they released a book, and it sounded like case closed. It sounded like this was it. But when you examine the minutiae of the story, it all collapses. Basically, the DNA evidence that they had showed that all it could have been was a semen sample from a Polish Jewish gentleman. They also said they had DNA samples on this cloth that came from Catherine Eddowes, which I'll get to in a minute because this for me is the real case closed. They said that this cloth was a gown, I forget what you call it, what a lady would wear around the upper part of her body. But in actual fact, it was a table runner, which would go on a Victorian table where people would put their candelabras and candles and things like that. The story was that when Catherine Eddowes was murdered, this piece of cloth was found at her murder scene and taken by a police officer called Amos Simpson. Amos Simpson wasn't even on duty that night in the city. So how he supposedly got that from the murder scene is very, very dodgy in itself. And then the idea that that her DNA was on it, it couldn't be proven that it was her DNA, but it came from the family line. However, we tested that cloth for a TV show that we made, and we couldn't get clear enough samples from the cloth. And also, the cloth was presented at a Jack the Ripper conference. And at that Jack the Ripper conference, the people that posed with it and handled it were Catherine Eddowes' descendants. So how can they rule out contamination from them? And it just, the case just fell apart, basically. It was on very shady ground. And we get that a lot. We get people testing the letters for DNA and the stamps for DNA. And people have said, can we not dig up the bodies and test them for DNA? Well, what DNA is going to be on the body? It's not like he cut them open and licked the bones. So it's just ridiculous, the lengths that people will try and go to get this sorted and get this solved.
I think Jack the Ripper is probably one of my favorite serial killers out there, just because of his elusiveness, who he was, why he was. the whole reason of, well, what made him do what he did, and I think that's what everyone wants to try to find out. They want to know, was he this, was he that, and like maybe that's where all these theories come from. He was a Mason, he was part of the royal family. No, he was a butcher. He was a doctor. He was my least favorite is that he was a Native American. That makes sense. So yeah, it's interesting.
We watched
But
a documentary a couple of nights ago.
after watching From Hell, it was interesting to see that concept come to life. And then after watching it several times, I'm like, impossible. No, impossible. Great theatrics, great ideas, but I don't think so.
I mean, the amazing thing.
We watched a documentary a couple of nights ago and involved the royal family at the time. And one, I don't know if you've heard this, I don't know, Mike and Jennifer. One theory was it was actually a member of the royal family who had killed the first lady, and she was the intended target, but then they bought to kill other ones to cover it up. What do you think of that theory?
I have no idea.
In terms of the royal family, there were 3 suspects. So we'll start with the silly one. Queen Victoria herself was accused of being Jack the Ripper. It was said that she walked around the East End dressed as a midwife, and she was conducting abortions and killing people off. But pretty much everyone would have known who she was, because she would have had her pictures on all the coins at the time, and all the notes and all the stamps. So everyone would have known what she looked like. The second suspect from the royal family was her son, Prince Albert Edward, and it was known he liked unfortunate women, loose women. It was known he was a bit of a ladies' man, and it was known that he also used to hang around in the East End because he was interested in the local fire brigade, and he used to go and join the fire brigade and help them put out fires and stuff like that. However, in 1888, at the time of the Ripper murders, Queen Victoria was up in Scotland. And in 1888, at the time of the Ripper murders, Prince Albert Edward was over in Europe. He was hunting, looking for wild boar and things like that. But then his son, Prince Albert Victor, was also accused of being Jack the Ripper. He was linked to ladies and things like that. However, he was local. He was in Yorkshire at the time of the Ripper murders. In fact, at one point, he was in Hull. He came to the Headland races. So we know that he couldn't have been there because he was nowhere near. And all of this was documented at the time in the court circulars, which were published in the newspaper, where the royals, it's like today with the tabloids, telling you everything about where they are and what time and this kind of thing. So they were all accused. And then the Queen's physician, Walter Gull, he was accused of being Jack the Ripper. He was featured in From Hell as Jack the Ripper. But in actual fact, in 1887, he had a stroke. And it was said that he was bedbound, unable to move in 1888, and therefore was unable to be Jack the Ripper. And the story about him being Jack the Ripper came from a guy who was a psychic. And he reckoned he'd had dreams and visions that this man was Jack the Ripper. And authors have gone on to believe that. So yeah, I mean, it's and then the Prince Albert Victor's tutor was accused of being Jack the Ripper. So there was, if you was alive in the Victorian period, you're fair game, basically. And that's the way it is. People don't need to prove you was in London these days. People will just write a book and fill it with any old nonsense. And what we've found is, with Jack the Ripper books, what you'll get is 12 chapters. The first 11 chapters will all be about the case, and that last chapter will just be the evidence against their suspect. And you'll often find when you peer review it, it falls apart under scrutiny. And we've seen that time and time again over the years. We've seen some fantastical, wonderfully imaginative suspects put forward, from all walks of life, from actors to poets to artists, you name it.
It's just, I know there was a policeman. He was a suspect as well, was it not?
There's been a couple of policemen. There's been a couple of police officers that have been put forward as suspects over the years. It was argued that police officers would know the beats of other police officers. They would know where all the police officers are that night and just be able to get in and kill. And of course, afterwards, they would be dressed as police officers, so no one would suspect them. When the whistle gets blown, they could go to the scene and no one would think anything different. But I find that quite disrespectful. These guys were out there in what was essentially a melting pot. It was there was hundreds of nationalities, hundreds of thousands of people, all different religions, all living together, packed in these very densely populated areas. And these poor police officers were out there trying their best to keep everyone safe in the middle of this serial killer scare. So to accuse them of being a suspect, I found it quite upset. A book was only released this month naming a police officer as a suspect. I've yet to read it, but I'd like to have a look and just review some of the evidence that they've got.
James saying as is always fast, probably not the right word to use considering the circumstances, but I get lost listening to all the possibilities. There is numerous possibilities, really, isn't there?
Look at that documentary we watched with, was it Broadmoor? And the guy was called, was it Thomas Cutbush?
Mm-hmm.
Was meant to have done it because he went into the asylum just as the murders had finished.
I watched that last night. That was quite good. We covered, Sarah covered the Ripper before. One thing that always kind of fascinated me, made me wonder was, you've got this guy, he's a guy, I mean, I've got the possibility that it could have been a woman. I think when you see the word serial killer, just associated with, men, it's just men. But there's been a lot of women, women serial killers, down through the years, kind of thing. My thoughts started from you've got this guy who's out the blue, maybe just started killing these women in quite a horrific way. I don't think maybe killed that kind of movie line, but I started thinking, what kind of background did they maybe came from? What kind of upbringing did they have? Did they have a grudge? Sometimes you'll get individuals who do it because they've got a grudge against women, a grudge against men, whatever. This is what I started kind of thinking. What about
Question.
growing up? Did they come to a well-to-do background? Is that maybe why all the women trusted them because they looked, maybe respectable? Or was it did he come to some kind of abusive home? Maybe abused by his mother, and this is where his hatred for women came.
I've heard that theory before about the whole mother thing, about the being abused of the mother, and that it was all revenge because of mother issues. I've heard this on 3 different podcasts. It seems to be a very favorite theme. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I can only imagine that he must have had some kind of angst. I'm not sure where the angst came from. He's very methodical. He taunted the police, obviously. But most serial killers are looking to get caught. So the question is, did he actually want to get caught? Was he looking to get caught? I don't know. It's a possibility that maybe he was just doing it just because he could taunt the police. Was it that inspector? I'm gonna get his name wrong. Aberdeen. That's inspector who came in later. He was part of the original. They brought him in. I can't remember. They brought him in as one of the other murders. I just can't remember which one it was. And he there's a newspaper article, mind you, I don't know if it's real or not, quoting him saying that he knew exactly who Jack the Ripper was. So why would he think that he knew? If instead of trying to figure out there's other suspects.
Did he come to money? I mean, obviously he was clever, and maybe some kind of medical training, which I dare say back in that year it always would cost. It would have to pay for some kind of medical training. So did he come from a well-to-do family? And he had the money to be well educated, to have this medical training, for doing his bits and pieces. What's your thoughts, Mike, on his, his kind of background sort of thing? Before he started
Yeah, I
becoming
mean,
Jack the Ripper?
in terms of the police opinions, Abelarm was just one of many who came forward with his opinion. In terms of the taunting and the arrest and things like that, people have often said because the police believed that those killings stopped with Mary Jane Kelly in November. Police believe that after that, people believe that after that, the police must have had their man. So they've looked for suspects that were incarcerated, locked in asylums, locked in prisons, and things like that. So people have used that as a starting point. In terms of the medical side of it, again, that's a double-edged sword. Some people believe he had medical experience. Some of the doctors believe that he didn't have medical experience. No two doctors agreed on various suspects, but that led people to believe that perhaps it was a doctor. Then from the back of that, perhaps it was a student who was involved in veterinary medicine, who was used to treating animals. Then that evolved and it became maybe it was a butcher. And in that area of East End at the time, you had a lot of Jewish butchers. So then a lot of Jewish butchers became suspects. So the case kind of evolved with every little bit of information that came forward. At one point, one of the stories was that Jack the Ripper killed them wearing a leather apron, so that when the blood splashed, it would wipe off and be cleaned away. And at that time, there was a gentleman called John Pizer whose nickname was Leather Apron. So he was accused of being Jack the Ripper, and he was arrested, and it was published in all the newspapers that he was Jack the Ripper. And while he was imprisoned, while he was being, waiting his interviews and things like that, another murder took place. So obviously wasn't him, and he got released. And when he was released, he actually took the newspapers to court and won in court because they'd accused him quite falsely of being Jack the Ripper. So there was so many weird and wonderful angles and cases, and you could get lost studying it. And in terms of his background, without a viable suspect, we'll never really know. But people have suggested perhaps he was bullied. Perhaps he wet the bed. Perhaps he had issues with his mother. Perhaps she was either too loving and overbearing, or perhaps the opposite. She was quite nasty to him. People have put forward that perhaps he was always living in his father's shadow, and that he wanted to get out and prove that he could be a man, and this, that, and the other, and this was his way of proving it. So there's all these different theories about his upbringing, and we often get students who they'll watch an episode of Criminal Minds. They'll read a Jack the Ripper book and they'll come straight into the case and say, well, we think, and they'll start coming out with stuff. And, and it's interesting to read because it gives fresh light. And it's the same when I go into primary schools. The kids are sort of 10 and 11 years old. And when I present the case to them, it's fascinating for me to get their opinion because they have fresh eyes and they don't get sidetracked by all the books and all the theories and all the different TV shows. They just listen to the facts. And it's really funny the kind of evidence that they put forward for their suspects and how they argue and debate about who they believe Jack was.
Oh, that's quite interesting. What if it's? I mean, all those are very, viable. But what if it's more simple than that, and we're not thinking simple enough? What if he just did it to do it? Maybe maybe there's no reason, but I can do it. I can do it, and that's it. And maybe that's why he never got caught. I mean, it could be that simple, but nobody wants to hear the simplicity, right? They want to know. No, it's got to be complex. There has to be a reason. But there has been serial killers past him that never really had a reason. They just did it to do it. So.
Well, I'm sure one of the big causations of crime and criminals is alcohol and or drug abuse. And it just so happens that all of these murders took place on a weekend. All of them took place either late Friday night, early Saturday morning, or late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, which is a time when most people are on the way home from the pub, or they've been out drinking or whatever. And back then, pubs were open quite a lot more than they are today in the UK. So they would have been open all hours. People would have been able to get access to alcohol at all hours. So perhaps he was just drunk You know, he was quite angsty and just wanted to do it, like you said. There doesn't have to be a motive, or there doesn't have to be a background, or you know, perhaps he was just an evil, nasty man, you know, who'd gone out and had a drink.
And
You know.
these women were just easier targets.
Yeah, definitely.
James asking, Mike, if you could put your money on someone, who would be the Ripper?
Oh, good one. I don't know. I did a lot of work on Frederick Billy Demon. I wrote a book about Demon. We did a TV show about him. He was a really interesting guy, but we just can't prove he was in London. There was a lot of people saying he was in London, but there was no evidence he was in London. So you can't conclusively pin it on him. You know, I think 3 eyewitnesses came forward that said they'd seen him in the East End, and they testified that they'd seen him in London at the time, but there wasn't enough evidence to conclusively say. And we found that a lot. There's a lot of kind of unsubstantiated facts, a lot of rumours and stuff like that. But Demon was interested because he killed his first wife, his 4 kids, and he killed his 3rd wife, and he cut all the throats. And this was after the Ripper murders. So when you're looking in terms of escalation, it goes up because it basically, after Mary Kelly, she was killed indoors. He then killed his wife and 4 kids indoors, but he buried them so they would never be found. And then he killed another woman, and he married her and took her to Australia. And in Australia, he killed her and cut her throat and buried her as well. And he was executed. And he actually wrote a booklet, a testimony, stating what he'd done, and his solicitor took it and burnt it. So we'll never know. But there was a lot of talk at the time that he was linked to the case and things like that. But like I say, it was all conjecture. There wasn't enough evidence. It was all circumstantial.
Who were you, girls? Who would you say? Who has to go first?
I don't know. I don't know.
I think he's somebody that's never been named. I don't think he's any of the suspects that have ever been named. I think he is an unknown, and he's lost to history, unfortunately. Unless there's somebody out there that has some evidence that we haven't seen yet, which, you know, like you said, once a year there's things that come up. But I'm a firm believer in that he's just an unknown. Just a...
Yep. If you speak to people that have been studying the case for years and years, their most popular suspect will be what they call the unknown local man, because he's never been named, he's never been looked at. I had family living in Whitechapel at the time. There were photographers living on Whitechapel Road. They could have been involved, but I would never go and accuse them without any evidence. Or like some people, you know, people going claiming that the great grandfather was Jack and all this kind of nonsense. You know, there's certainly a lot to be said about an unknown male at that time that's never been named. And it's funny when you go for the suspect list because they're hilarious. That some of them are really silly. One of my favourite ones, a movie was made in the 1930s. They accused the Loch Ness Monster of being Jack the Ripper. And there was a book published a few years ago. So yeah, from your neck of the woods. And then there was a book published a few years ago.
Sorry, I'm trying to wrap my head around the Loch Ness Monster being Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, no, there was a movie made some years ago.
I don't even know how that's possible.
No, well, the Thames wasn't that far away. He could have gone on holiday.
I get that, but oh, poor
I've
Ness.
never ever heard that.
Like, how does it hold a knife?
It's flippers.
I don't know how it does. Sorry.
And then another one was that travelling fairs were really popular, and at these travelling fairs they had menageries, and someone said perhaps it was an escaped gorilla that had gone around killing all these people, but the gorilla was never seen, and of course how does a gorilla hold a knife? But yeah, it was, so that was another one that was quite a dodgy suspect.
I think if it was like gorilla running about Whitechapel, somebody would have seen something. You know, you would know it's a gorilla. You'd know it's Nessie in person, you know.
Well, right. What was it? The leather apron thing is what got the whole Mason mystery going.
That was the other thing. You we were watching that documentary, and there was the leather apron that was found in the doorway. It, the story that one of the stories that was on was it actually belonged to a young man who was a tanner or something, and he just dumped it there. It was an old apron, and he dumped it there a couple of days before. You know, it was found on his way home, whatever. You know, the apron was knackered, and it was a case of right, dump that. You think that there's any truth in
I
that?
understand why they went that route because my husband's a Mason and they do have the leather aprons for their ceremonies. So I completely understand why I think someone jumped to that conclusion. But those are usually, according to my husband, they're only worn during the ceremony. They don't necessarily wear them outside of the lodge hall. So that would be a big no-no for Masons to do that.
No, it was meant to be a tanner or
Right. I'm just saying, but that's where the Mason story came from, because Masons do wear a leather apron during their ceremonies.
it was maybe so. I can't remember. I think I might. I'm not.
No,
I'm not 100%.
I only know this because of my husband. My husband is he knows his Masonic history pretty well. Yeah.
Leather apron, jacket up in the
Leather
right
apron,
jacket.
Yep. Yeah, it's just interesting.
Very,
Very interesting.
I mean, my theory, and this is just my theory. I'm probably 100 miles off the target. You know, but you don't need to agree with me before you even say it. At least hear me out first. You know, that it was an unknown, well, he'd have been known in the neighbourhood. You know, but to me, he had some kind of mother issue, and that would explain the frenzy in which he killed these women. It was just sheer hatred for women, and you know, like 39 stabbings, 16 stabbings, whatever. It's just way over the top to kill somebody, and to me, that's just sheer hatred. You know, determination, especially with Mary Kelly, the Mary Kelly one, and I don't think it was just five. This is just my opinion. I say I might be 100 miles off the mark. Who knows? I don't think it was just the five. And why? Then there's a question of what happened to him. Did he get fed up doing it? You know,
I think that is an age-old question. Why did the killings stop?
Yeah. Again, it's based on your chosen suspect. So in some instances, there were suspects that committed suicide. In some instances, there were suspects that died of natural causes. In some instances, there were suspects that got locked away in asylums. In some instances, there were suspects that got locked up in prisons. In some instances, there were suspects that left the country. So it all depends on your chosen suspect why it stopped. I know one guy I researched was a doctor. He was born in India. He came to Hull, lived in the west side of the city, and he was in London in 1888, and he died in December 1888 because he was a doctor with medical training, because he was in London, and because he died just after the last murder. People accused him of being Jack the Ripper, and there was no evidence whatsoever to link him to the crimes. He was just in the wrong place at that time, and you know, ended up dying. And the manner of his illness would have meant that he probably wouldn't have been able to walk around much anyway at that period. But you get a lot of people looking at stuff like that where they say, oh, perhaps it was this man who was locked in this asylum, you know, or perhaps it was this gentleman who was arrested and sent to prison for whatever. It all goes on your chosen suspects as to why. I'd love to know why. You know, I'd love to know why they stopped. If they did stop, you know, there were murders in Whitechapel going on and on and on, right up to sort of 1892, where unfortunate women were found with the throats cut and things like that. So there's a possibility that it did continue for many years. You know, people have looked at, did he go to? There were killings in Paris. There were killings in America. There were killings elsewhere in the UK. At one point, there was a murder in Bradford in December 1888 of a little boy. Initially, people accused that of being a Jack the Ripper crime. There was a girl in up near Gateshead in September 1888. She was murdered. She was linked in with the Jack the Ripper case. So there's been other murders elsewhere with other victims, and people have been quite eager to tie them in. And in my opinion, it just convolutes it and makes it even more of a muddy water. You know, you can't really concentrate on because you've got all these little aspects to study.
You actually just answered my next question there, Mike. That's what I was going to ask. Was there any other murders in the UK that resembled, you know, the Ripper murders for London? Maybe he get fed up in London and decided I'm going to, or maybe, you know, go elsewhere, or maybe thought, you know, things were getting too hot in London and I'll go elsewhere and start again. You know.
Yeah, I mean, in London alone, in on Thursday, December 20th, 1888, Rose Marlett was found murdered. On Wednesday, July 17th, 1889, Alice Mackenzie was found murdered. There was a torso found on September 10th, 1889, in a place called Pinchin Street in London. Frances Coles was murdered on Friday the 13th of February, 1891. And all these women were killed in a very similar manner using, knives and things like that. And they're just the ones in London. Like I say, there was stuff going on in Bradford, there was stuff going on in Gateshead, stuff going on all over the place. And a lot of it was linked to Jack the Ripper. And that's without going into regional Jack the Ripper scares. There was a girl in Bradford called Maria Coroner. She was arrested for sending Jack the Ripper letters. There was a number of Ripper scares right across the country where people were sending Ripper letters to their, to friends. There was a story of a girl who'd been sent a Ripper letter from a best mate. Had sent her a Ripper letter, scared the crap out of her, and then in the middle of the bed, she jumped up at the bottom of the bed and shouted, "Hi, I'm Jack the Ripper." You can imagine what the girl did. She, pooed herself a little bit. She was terrified. There was cases like that where any man with a knife was accused of being Jack the Ripper. There was cases in Hull. A gentleman called Samuel Noble was arrested for Jack the Ripper-like conduct. All he was doing was running up to women and lifting their skirts up. And the media just had a field day with it because it sold newspapers. All the way up to in the year 1900, a gentleman in Hull stabbed 5 women, and he stabbed them in the bum. And he basically ran down a place called Beverley Road and stabbed one after the other in the bum. And he was sent to prison, but in the press he was called Jack the Ripper. And there was nothing linking him to the case other than 5 women and a knife. But you found that time and time again, the local and national cases would get linked in with the Jack the Ripper case. And again, it convoluted the area of study, made it all the more confusing. And the same with the Ripper letters. It was estimated that about 1,000 Ripper letters were getting received a day back in that period. Many of them have been destroyed, but if you go to the London Metropolitan Archives, the National Archives, even some of the local archives in the UK still have Ripper letters that were sent at the time, said to have been from Jack the Ripper. And of course, they probably weren't from Jack the Ripper. They were probably from, bored students or newspaper men or things like that. But again, it convolutes the field of study.
It just shows you the impact that he did have, on the whole country, basically. If it was Jack the Ripper, no matter where you went, Jack the Ripper, it just shows you and the impact that he did have, and nobody had a clue who he was, why he was doing it, where was he from, where did he go, and it just it does, it literally blows your mind trying to get all the different theories, and even as you say, all the letters, copycat. We've all heard that serial killers and
possibly copycat killers
copy them, and so maybe murders in the UK, Hull, wherever they look like murders, but they just copy it.
Well, in America, there's the Atlanta Ripper, and then you had there's like at least 3 other Rippers way later that garnered the Ripper thing, but they also claim that they put Jack the Ripper like in the school. So they used him as their mentor. So that's kind of creepy as it is. So we had other serial killers that came way later that used Jack the Ripper as their model of how to kill. That's pretty sad. Wow.
You get those people that have got a fixation with serial killers, and so, I mean, especially you're in America with death row. How many times do you hear a woman falling in love with convicted killers on death row? Getting in and getting married and all the rest of it. So for some reason, you do get these people who worship these serial killers. Think they're, I don't know, heroes. Whatever. Jack the Ripper probably being, obviously, maybe the most famous serial killer in UK history. Obviously, you're going to get people, I'm Jack the Ripper, you could be the Yorkshire Ripper as well, over here, back in the 80s, I think it was, Peter Sutcliffe.
70s and 80s, yeah.
Was it 70s or 80s he was?
70s and 80s, yeah, the Yorkshire Ripper.
And
then in,
exactly.
in the 1960s in London, you had the Jack the Stripper, who was going around and stripping ladies and tying their underwear around their neck and things like that. And then you also had, during World War II, the Blackout Ripper. That was another serial killer. So he's kind of become an inspiration, really, for all these criminals.
Yeah. I mean, in America, the most prolific Ripper that we had was the Atlanta Ripper, and he was horrible. Oh my God! Just the women that he went after, it was just awful.
I mean, the word Ripper, it's a worldwide word, but do you think maybe the Ripper, blah, blah, blah. I think they all kind of say that the title Ripper stems from Jack the Ripper.
I would think so. Think about it. Ripper, doesn't matter what name you put in front of it. The Ripper, it's terrifying. It already was terrifying. Jack the Ripper. Now you're adding the York Ripper, the Atlanta Ripper, whatever. So now you have this terrifying persona that is after whatever name you put in front of it. That's probably a lot of serial killers end up with these nicknames. The Smiley Face Killer. That was a fun one. The Zodiac, which never ever was solved. So just take those for examples. So you have Jack the Ripper, who isn't he deemed like to be the first real serial killer, even though there's probably serial killers before that, but the real looked at serial killer, I think. So you have him moving forward on serial killers from the late 1800s until even now. We still have serial killers today, which is kind of creepy to think about.
I think it's something we're always going to have. Just before we went, I'm just wasting time for you. Any questions for me?
Obviously, I've always wondered this, right? Obviously, the kind of most famous Jack the Ripper letter was the Dear Boss letter, right? And obviously, at the bottom of that, it was signed Jack the Ripper. So, what do you think that letter actually came from the murderer, or do you think it was a kind of newspaper person that wrote it and gave him that nickname?
Well, there's two sides. On the one side, there's the people that believe it came from Jack, that it came from the serial killer himself, because obviously it'd given his name and it'd given little bits of details on there and stuff like that. On the flip side of that, there was a lot of police officers at the time that believed it was a hoax created by newspaper men. And then in later years, you had a number of newspaper men come forward and say, well, actually, we did hoax some of the letters. They never mentioned which ones. So it's quite possible that it's a hoax. It's a real shame that more wasn't done to try and preserve it and get more evidence from it. It's been looked at by handwriting experts. It's been looked at by calligraphy experts. It's been looked at by paper experts. It's been looked at by experts in ink. It's been looked at by linguistic experts who look at the languages, because they said that letter had a number of Americanisms in it. Dear boss, and the word buckle and things like that. So people obviously use that as evidence to back up their suspects if they had links to America. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm in two minds with the Ripper letters. Those Ripper letters were sent to Hull. And they've sadly all vanished now. We don't know where they've all gone, but they were reported in the press at the time. And some of them were wonderful. Some of them had poetry. Some of the Ripper letters had sketches. They would draw things like skeletons and coffins. Quite dark things. I saw one Ripper letter that it looked like it had been painted. The handwriting was beautiful. It was like calligraphy. And none of them really made any sense. A lot of them read like the ramblings of a mad person. But that makes you think if it's been done on purpose to make us believe it's a person that's, it's on the edge and a little bit crazy. But I don't know about the Ripper letters. I've always been in two minds about them. I tend to swear against them being hoaxes. And they're not from Jack, but from people like newspaper officers or from people watching the case. At that time, if you can imagine, it would have been entertainment for people. They would have been reading the newspapers every day and thinking, well, maybe I can inject myself into this by writing a Ripper letter and sending it to London and things like that. So, it's quite possible that a lot of the Ripper letters were from people that just read the newspapers. There's stories of teenagers and stuff writing them and sending them to places. And like I say, Maria Coroner was arrested in 1888 in Bradford, and she went to court, and they proved that she'd sent Ripper letters to the Bradford police constables and stuff like that. So
it's just, as I said, to start, it's just sickening. These people would do it for a laugh or whatever, and consider,
whatever the reason may be. Think about it. All those letters, whether or not he wrote them or not, other serial killers decided to do the same thing. Similar, Son of Sam, Zodiac wrote. There's another one I can't remember that happened in Europe that wrote, I think in France, wrote poetry or something to the press. So Jack the Ripper, regardless whether or not he actually penned them, that started the craze that other serial killers, sorry about the feedback, would send things to the press, not necessarily to the police department. So that speaks a lot to if sent to the police department, does it make it more credible, or sending it to the press, does it make it more credible? I don't know.
Any more questions or theories?
I don't think so.
Well, Jennifer, you get any more questions for the man himself?
Oh, I could go on for hours questioning about Jack the Ripper. Are you kidding? He's a fascinating man, and yeah, I don't believe he was a woman. I'm pretty sure he was a man. Because just to overcome his victims, you'd have the sheer strength. Even if he offered them something to make them more comfortable, which has been offered in many books and movies. I don't know why. Oh, we got to make them more comfortable. That's how you subdue them. That's probably how they got the idea that a woman probably could have done it, because they would drug them. Okay, that's far-fetched. But not impossible, but I don't believe it's a woman.
The whole image, the whole top hat, Kate and doctors, where did they come from? Where did that image come from? I know it is quite a common portrayal.
So, at the time, if you saw someone suspicious, you could report that to your local newspaper office. So if you can imagine, if you went to work with your top hat on, or if you was a doctor and you had your medical bag with you, if you was on your way home at night after a long shift and you was just walking down the street, the next day someone might say, well, last night I saw this gentleman, he had his collar pulled up and his hat pulled down and he looked a little bit suspicious and he had his Gladstone bag with him. And then that story would get published in the press. Last night, this strange man was seen, and it would grow from there, really. Those kind of stories would grow from there. So those individuals were never seen at the crime scenes. They were just seen in the East End of London, which is a relatively big place. But the way the newspapers reported it, it was like, perhaps this might be a suspect. And then, when researchers come along 70, 80 years that later, they'll think, well, have we looked at this individual? Who might this individual be? So in the 1930s, for example, books started to get published on the case that were just full of half-truths. And they kind of became really popular and grew from there. And every so often you'd get another book that was quite influential, but there'd be mistakes in there. And that would just grow and grow and grow. And then you get people that would come and make movies or documentaries, and they'd perhaps pick up one of those dodgy books, read that Jack the Ripper wore a top hat, and that, the vision is given birth then, and it's on celluloid, and people are watching it on the screen and things like that. So that the mythos starts to grow, but the real character, the real person is ignored. Most people that saw him described him as looking like a sailor. Most people that saw the women with a gentleman that night said he had a flat cap on, and sometimes had like a little bow across his neck and things like that. No one ever said, oh, well, he had a top hat and a cloak and a bag or anything like that. But those kind of descriptions just grew and grew and grew. And it's really funny when you read through some of the old newspaper reports, the way they take these stories and sensationalize them. And it's the same today. We do it exactly the same today. Nothing has changed in the media whatsoever. And you can guarantee every time the British media does a story on Jack the Ripper, they will have a picture of a man walking away from the camera, carrying a Gladstone bag, wearing a cloak and having a top hat. And the same with books. If you look on the front covers of Jack the Ripper books, there's a lot of books out there with his top hat on and stuff like that. That's the image that people conjure up now when they think about Jack the Ripper. Even the Jack the Ripper coins that I got, on all the coins, he's got a top hat and he's wearing a cloak and stuff like that. So the image is still conjured up today of that's how he looked like.
I read an article saying that that a witness described him having a deerstalker hat.
Deerstalker.
Yeah, and I think that would be more realistic than a top hat, honestly.
Yep. One of my favourites, a few years ago, they made a photo fit of what they believed Jack the Ripper looked like based on the descriptions made by all the people. And when they published it, it looked like Freddie Mercury from Queen. So it was hilarious because the similarities between the two, it really did look like poor Freddie. But yeah, it was.
I think, the top hat, Kate, blah, blah, blah. I think he would do just a blend in. I think the way he was just he would want to blend in. To me, the last thing he would want to do is stick out. I think he would just want to be unnoticed. Because I was with that area of Whitechapel at that time, there was loads of Polish, you name it. It was just everybody was in there. And so I think he was blended in. Saying awesome screen guys, I don't think he'd be ready for the taste.
Sweet.
Thanks for joining us, Jeff. So I think we've just been plain Jane, plain Jack, whatever you like.
Right. But having the top hat, the cloak, or whatever, that ends up romanticizing the character and romanticizes the serial killer into something more elusive. It becomes a inescapable creature that you can't catch.
Maybe one day. Who knows? Probably not.
Sorry, I've read way too many serial killers.
But I think we'll wrap it up there. If that's all right with you, ladies. I know I've done a lot of talking.
No, because there's only one thing that we didn't touch on because that's for next time.
I was saving that for next time.
We're saving it for next time.
Laura, is fascinating live video, all your theories and personal thoughts. So I'll just hang on to you a wee second after we go off, Mike.
Yeah.
That's all right. Mike is back with us. I can't remember the date. Sorry, it's in the schedule there.
But yeah. So, and part one.
August the 4th.
4th of August, Mike is back with us, but we're not doing Jack the Ripper, we're doing Mike the Man.
Mike
you
the
know,
Man.
'cause there's you like that Mike the Man.
Mike the Man.
I'll
See,
wear my top hat.
now we have a new nickname. There you go, Mike the Man.
Doctor's bag. Cake.
You have been pinned.
You've been Mike the Man. Is there nothing wrong with that?
No? But
Mad
you're
Mike,
making it look like the third man's a woman now.
Woo.
Mike the Man. Next time we'll be talking to Mike the Man. What is it, the new a woman?
I was talking Mike. All right. Is that? Sorry, Mike. No, you know.
Anyway,
You made me forget what I was going to say. No, Mike. He's not just he's not just the kind of ripper guy. That sounds bad and all, doesn't it? I'm just thinking about home here, aren't I?
no comment.
Mike's got a lot of strings to his bow, and so the 4th of August we're getting Mike back in if we're going to talk about all his other bits and pieces, paranormal stuff, etc. Then how's that? Is that better? Yes. Right. Thank you very much for that. So that's us for tonight, folks. I'll just hang on to you guys just for a wee second. We're back on to what? All right. I thought I forgot something. No, that's fine. A massive thanks to Mike over there.
Over there. Because you got you get your fingers pointed. Because he's on my screen.
We're back on tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. We're talking about one of the greatest eras in British history. Mm-hmm. Susie, what she knows it? Is that the water?
That's on you guys.
We're going to be talking about probably one of the most famous monarchs, no disrespect to anybody else, but one of the most famous monarchs UK's ever seen. Henry VIII, his brother Arthur, his father, and basically his reign, his wife's, blah, 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 all the toys and whistles. We're doing that tomorrow night. Now, who's your favourite?
Mary Queen of Scots. You have to ask.
Mary Queen of Scots. All right, let's ask Mike. Mike, who's your favourite monarch?
Who's my favourite who?
Monarch.
Sorry?
Monarch. You say it, because I'm Scottish, you're half English.
Monarch. Leave that.
Monarch. Queen Victoria.
What about yours, Jared? I know you're American. You must have.
Oh, contraire, mon frere. I do have some favorites. I like King James and his thoughts. King James I. I also enjoyed King Henry VIII, and I enjoyed Queen Mary.
Oh, there you go. Henry, the Tudor reign, basically, and what went on and what have you. So that's us again. Last thanks to Mike for coming in. We hope you enjoyed the Jack the Ripper. We will be doing another one about
another theory that we didn't talk about.
Something else we didn't talk about. And thanks to Jennifer as well and Sarah. So we'll see you tomorrow night, folks. Hopefully, enjoy what's left of the weekend. Take care for now. Bye.